For a moment, just a moment, the world held its breath. Anne Boleyn's severed head lay in the straw, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, as if frozen mid-thought. Her body collapsed beside it in eerie silence, blood soaking the gray linen of her execution gown. Some whispered that for 5 seconds her brain still functioned, that she might have been aware of the horror unfolding from within her own dismembered mind. Whether myth or truth, the image alone chilled London to its core. This was no common criminal, no foreign enemy. This was a crowned queen of England, mother of the future, once the obsession of a king, now discarded like a broken relic. Just hours ago, she had walked the cold stone courtyard of the Tower of London, with her spine straight, her hands folded, her eyes unflinching. There were no screams, no last-minute pleas, only silence, steel, and finality. How did it come to this? How does a woman once so powerful that a king shattered his kingdom to possess her, now lie decapitated beneath a leaden sky? This is not just the story of a death. It is the unraveling of a myth, the destruction of a voice that dared to rise too far, too fast, in a world ruled by men. Anne Boleyn's final breath may have been quiet, but what came before it, scandal, love, betrayal, reform, ambition, was a storm that shook the foundation of an empire. And what came after would echo for centuries. She knelt to the sword, but history would not forget. For a moment, just a moment, the world held its breath. Anne Boleyn's severed head lay in the straw, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, as if frozen mid-thought. Her body collapsed beside it in eerie silence, blood soaking the gray linen of her execution gown. Some whispered that for 5 seconds her brain still functioned, that she might have been aware of the horror unfolding from within her own dismembered mind. Whether myth or truth, the image alone chilled London to its core. This was no common criminal, no foreign enemy. This was a crowned queen of England, mother of the future, once the obsession of a king, now discarded like a broken relic. Just hours ago, she had walked the cold stone courtyard of the Tower of London with her spine straight, her hands folded, her eyes unflinching. There were no screams, no last-minute pleas, only silence, steel, and finality. How did it come to this? How does a woman once so powerful that a king shattered his kingdom to possess her now lie decapitated beneath a leaden sky? This is not just the story of a death. It is the unraveling of a myth, the destruction of a voice that dared to rise too far, too fast, in a world ruled by men. Anne Boleyn's final breath may have been quiet, but what came before it, scandal, love, betrayal, reform, ambition, was a storm that shook the foundation of an empire, and what came after would echo for centuries. She knelt to the sword, but history would not forget. May 19th, 1536. The sun rose reluctantly over London, hidden behind a ceiling of heavy gray clouds. A cold mist clung to the stone walls of the tower, swallowing the sound of footsteps and muffling the cries of gulls overhead. The River Thames, once a symbol of trade and triumph, seemed to stand still, unmoving, unwilling to carry the weight of what was about to happen. In the inner ward of the tower, a scaffold had been erected overnight. It wasn't the grand, towering platform of public executions. This one was lower, quieter, intimate, as if death itself had been summoned to walk among the living without spectacle. Beside it stood a small group of guards. Their armor gleamed dully in the muted light, their eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to meet each other's gaze. Inside the Queen's lodgings, Anne Boleyn stood in silence. She had not slept, not truly, only drifted in and out of prayer, her hands wrapped around the same rosary she had once clutched in joy the day she was crowned. Now those same fingers fastened the fur lining of her dark gray cloak. The color choice was deliberate, solemn, respectful, and fitting for a woman who had once worn gold-embroidered gowns and pearls the size of grapes. Beneath the cloak, a deep red bodice lay hidden. The hue wasn't chosen for vanity, but for concealment, so that when the blade found her neck, the blood would be masked by crimson. She moved with quiet purpose, like a queen preparing for a final court appearance. Her face was pale but composed. Her dark eyes, once filled with fire and wit, were now calm, wide and distant, focused on something beyond the courtyard, beyond the pain, beyond this world. Only 17 days earlier, Anne had lived in royal chambers, dined beside the king, and walked in gowns lined with ermine. Now her kingdom was reduced to cold stone walls and whispers. The same tower that had once saluted her with cannon fire now waited to devour her whole. But she did not flinch. Anne Boleyn was no longer queen in name, but in spirit. She stood taller than the men who had condemned her. She would not walk to the scaffold as a victim. She would walk like a monarch. Before the blade, before the blood, before the crown, there was a girl with dark eyes and dangerous ideas. Anne Boleyn was not born to be queen. She was born into a noble but modest family, privileged, yes, but far from royalty. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, descended from one of England's oldest families. But it wasn't her bloodline that set Anne apart. It was her mind. As a teenager, Anne was sent abroad, first to the Netherlands, then to the French court of Queen Claude. It was there, among poets and painters, philosophers and reformers, that Anne absorbed the spirit of the Renaissance. She learned to speak fluent French, studied scripture, history, music, and courtly charm. But more importantly, she observed power and how it moved through rooms. When she returned to England in 1522, Anne was not the typical English rose. Her skin was olive-toned, her hair long and dark, her eyes sharp and knowing. In an era that worshipped fair-skinned, golden-haired women, Anne defied the aesthetic, but no one could look away. She didn't beg for attention. She commanded it. And soon she caught the gaze of the most powerful man in the land, King Henry VIII. Henry was still married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Their union had failed to produce a male heir, and frustration gnawed at the king's pride. When he noticed Anne, he assumed she would be like the others, grateful for his favor, flattered by his pursuit. But Anne wasn't Mary Boleyn, her sister who had once warmed the king's bed. She wanted more than a title or a touch. When Henry pressed, she answered with words that would become legend. "If you want my body, give me a crown." It was not flirtation. It was strategy. What followed was 7 years of obsession, negotiation, and chaos. Henry sought a divorce from the Pope. Rome said no. So Henry did the unthinkable. He broke away. He declared himself head of a new Church of England, severed ties with the Vatican, and redefined the nation's faith, all for the woman who had refused to kneel until he offered a throne. Anne Boleyn didn't just change her fate. She changed the fate of England. In June 1533, Anne Boleyn entered Westminster Abbey, not as a mistress, not as a scandal, but as Queen of England. Her coronation was extravagant, defiant, and unapologetically grand, a clear message to the kingdom the new order had begun. But Anne was never content to simply wear a crown. She intended to rule beside it. Unlike queens before her, Anne had no interest in being a silent consort. She was vocal, strategic, and ideologically fierce. Where others curtsied and smiled, she challenged and directed. She aligned herself with reformers, pushed for the translation of the Bible into English, and supported scholars who envisioned a church unbound from Rome. She was not only Henry's wife, she was his partner in revolution. And that terrified the establishment. The old noble families, still loyal to Catherine of Aragon, whispered that Anne was a social climber, a seductress, a witch in silks. The Catholic Church called her the source of England's spiritual decay. Even within the royal court, her enemies multiplied: courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and advisors who resented her power and feared her reach. Every smile she gave was dissected. Every word she spoke was quoted back with venom. She had few allies, and even fewer she could trust. Still, she moved with certainty. Anne appointed Protestant tutors for her daughter Elizabeth. She protected thinkers deemed dangerous by the clergy. She wrote letters to foreign leaders defending England's new spiritual path. Her ambition was not masked by charm, it was crowned with it. Yet her position was never secure. Her greatest political asset, Henry's passion, was also her greatest vulnerability. The same obsession that had once torn apart the Catholic world for her now began to cool. Henry, disappointed by the birth of a daughter and a subsequent miscarriage, grew restless. Anne felt the shift in his glances, the silence at dinners, the growing shadow of Jane Seymour at court. She fought to hold her place, not just as wife, but as a voice for change, and the more she spoke, the more isolated she became. Anne was not a queen who merely occupied a throne, she transformed it. But in doing so, she provoked a backlash from a world not ready to be ruled by a woman who refused to be quiet. The court, the church, the crown they had once bent for her. Now they began to plot. Power never slips away all at once. It unravels in silence through cold glances, unanswered letters, and mornings, when footsteps no longer pause at your door. For Anne Boleyn, the unraveling began with heartbreak. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Though healthy and spirited, she was not the son Henry VIII had hoped for. Still, Anne remained confident. The future could yet deliver a male heir, but the pressure, spoken and unspoken, wrapped itself around her like a tightening noose. In 1534, Anne suffered her first miscarriage. She grieved quietly, knowing that sympathy would not protect her. Henry, once so consumed by love that he'd burned a bridge to Rome, began to turn inward. His eyes grew distant, his words clipped, his touch, once eager, became a political formality. By early 1536, Anne was pregnant again. This time, she carried hope like armor. But in January, everything shifted. Henry, during a jousting tournament, was thrown violently from his horse. He was unconscious for hours. Word of his possible death reached Anne quickly, and the shock pierced through her like a blade. Days later, she miscarried once more. It was a boy. Her grief was twofold: the loss of a child and the realization that she was running out of chances to secure her place. The court felt it. Whispers resumed. The old families grew bolder. Jane Seymour, gentle quiet, the perfect contrast, began appearing more often at the king's side. Anne, once the sun around which the court revolved, now felt like a shadow moving through marble halls. Then came the final blow, not from a rival woman, but from a man who had once been her ally, Thomas Cromwell. They had shared common ground, once united in reform and ambition. But Cromwell understood power better than loyalty. He sensed Henry's waning affection and seized his chance. Quietly, he began gathering rumors, baseless, malicious, poisonous. Anne's circle, already small, began to collapse. Every friend became a threat, every conversation a risk. She had built her reign on boldness, but now that boldness left her exposed. She stood in rooms that once welcomed her, now filled with silence and suspicion. The courtiers who once bowed deeply now offered only brief nods. The air around her chilled not from weather, but from isolation. Anne Boleyn had not yet been tried. But in the hearts of those who once smiled in her presence, the verdict was already forming, and it was not mercy. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn stood before a jury, not of her peers, but of her executioners. The trial was held at the Tower of London in a makeshift court assembled more for theater than justice. The charges against her were as wild as they were absurd: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king, and high treason against the crown. No evidence held weight. No witness spoke with certainty. But in Tudor England, the appearance of guilt was enough. And Anne, once adored and unstoppable, now stood alone. She had no defense counsel, no advocate, just her voice. But what a voice it was! Anne addressed the court with the same intelligence and sharp composure that once enchanted kings and scholars alike. She questioned the logic of the accusations' exposed contradictions and challenged the men before her with grace, not desperation. She reminded them that a queen does not kneel to whispers, nor does a woman of dignity confess to fiction. But they weren't listening. The jury had already been chosen from among her enemies, men with titles, ambitions, and vendettas. Many owed their rise to Henry. None would dare disappoint him. The room was quiet, not from respect, but from choreography. The outcome was inevitable. Outside the court, the people of London waited, some in disbelief, others in morbid anticipation. But within those stone walls, the verdict was not shaped by truth. It was crafted by power. Guilty. The sentence, death by burning, a fate reserved for the most reviled. Henry, in what he called mercy, later commuted the sentence to beheading. He sent for a skilled French swordsman, one known for clean, swift executions. A subtle nod to Anne's rank, perhaps, but also an attempt to soften the stain of what was about to unfold. Anne showed no collapse, no public weeping. She thanked the court for their time and returned to her chambers with her head held high. Her ladies-in-waiting, though devastated, followed her in stunned silence. Behind the doors, Anne knelt to pray not for herself, but for her daughter, for England, and for the soul of a king who had once sworn eternal love. What happened that day was not justice. It was the final act of a political play written by men afraid of a woman who had reached too high, spoken too clearly, and dared to rule in a world built to silence her. Anne Boleyn had been condemned, but she had not been broken. Morning broke gray and still. The Tower of London loomed like a tomb, its walls damp with mist, its windows shut tight against what was to come. Inside her small stone chamber, Anne Boleyn stood for the last time. She had risen before the sun. Her face was pale, but resolute. She moved without haste, her hands steady as she fastened the modest gray gown chosen for her execution. A simple cloak covered her shoulders, the same dark fabric she had worn days earlier. Beneath it, the crimson bodice worn not for vanity, but to conceal the blood soon to spill. Around her, her ladies-in-waiting wept in silence. Anne did not. She moved to each of them with gentle hands, offering small tokens. Her prayer book a ring, a handkerchief, not as gifts, but as memories. She whispered her final words to them, not in fear, but in calm. "Remember me and how I end." Her voice was soft, certain. When the guards knocked, she rose without delay. Outside, the courtyard was eerily quiet. Around 1,000 spectators stood in hushed reverence, heads uncovered, eyes cast downward. This was not the roaring crowd of a public execution. This was mourning, dressed in silence. Even the sky seemed to dim in anticipation. Anne walked with dignity, her back straight, her pace controlled. She climbed the low scaffold alone without aid. The French swordsman stood nearby, his blade concealed behind his back. He did not speak. Anne turned to the crowd, folded her hands, and addressed them in a voice that rang clear across the stones. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to law. I do not say I am innocent, but I pray God to have mercy on my soul. I pray for the king. He is a good and gentle prince." She asked for no pity. She blamed no one. Then she removed her headdress. One of her ladies stepped forward, her hands trembling, and tied a blindfold around Anne's eyes. Anne adjusted it once by instinct. Then, kneeling gracefully, she folded her hands and waited. The swordsman called softly for his assistant to fetch the sword. The distraction was calculated. Anne turned her head slightly, and in that breathless instant, the blade struck. No scream, no struggle, only a clean, swift silence. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, fell, not with fear but with poise. She had lost everything, but she met death on her own terms, not as a traitor, not as a broken woman, but as a queen, dignified, unshaken, and immortal in her final stillness. They buried Anne Boleyn in silence. No procession, no state funeral, no royal honors. Her body was placed in a simple arrow chest, the kind used to store weapons, and laid beneath the chapel floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the very tower where she had once dined in triumph. Her name was whispered, then nearly erased. The court turned the page with brutal speed. Within days, King Henry VIII was engaged to Jane Seymour. Life moved on, but history did not. Anne's voice, though silenced by steel, continued to echo, first in the shadows, then in the throne room. She had left behind a daughter. Elizabeth Tudor was just 2 years old when her mother was executed. Declared illegitimate by her father, stripped of title and inheritance, she was cast aside like her mother before her. But something of Anne burned in that child, the sharp mind, the unyielding will, the fire of defiance clothed in royal grace. And when Elizabeth rose, she did not rise as a forgotten girl. She rose as a queen who would rule England for 45 years, ushering in an era of power poetry and pride known as the Elizabethan Golden Age. Anne Boleyn's legacy lived not in marble, but in blood, not in statues, but in the strength of her daughter's crown. She had changed the course of a nation, splitting it from Rome, birthing a new church, and reshaping the role of women at court forever. She proved that a woman could not only captivate a king, but challenge him, advise him, and even outlive his legacy through her own. To her enemies, she was a scandal. To history, she became a symbol of feminine resilience, of political defiance, of courage under impossible weight. Anne rose in a world built to silence her, and when they struck her down, they discovered something far more dangerous, a woman who had become eternal. The silence after her death did not last. It transformed into memory, into myth, and finally into power. Today, nearly 5 centuries later, her story still commands attention, not just because she died, but because she dared to live as no woman had before her, intelligent, ambitious, unapologetic. She refused to shrink even in the face of swords. She refused to submit even when the crown turned cold. Anne Boleyn's life did not end on that scaffold. It began its second chapter in the pages of history in the reign of her daughter and in the hearts of every woman who ever dared to rise above the limits imposed upon her. She knelt to the sword, but stood tall in history. Anne Boleyn's story is not just a tragedy. She lived in a world designed to silence women, to keep them compliant, ornamental, and invisible. But Anne refused every script handed to her. She used her voice in rooms that weren't meant to hear it. She challenged kings, questioned priests, and reshaped the very religion of her country, not with, "And for that they killed he," but they did not erase her. Anne's voice, sharp and unafraid, survives in every woman who has ever been punished for speaking too loudly, for daring too much, for stepping outside the line drawn by tradition. Her execution was meant to be an ending. Instead, it became a symbol, a monument to the danger and the necessity of a woman who will not be quiet. Centuries later, her story still unnerves us, not because she fell, but because she rose. She rose from diplomacy and culture in European courts to the heart of English monarchy. She rose in defiance of kings, of the Vatican, of every barrier meant to keep her in her place. She rose until the entire weight of power felt threatened by her presence. That is what they couldn't forgive, not treason, not adultery, but audacity. Anne Boleyn's voice was radical, not just in content, but in existence. She spoke when it was safer to stay silent. She stood when the world told her to kneel. And even in her final hour, blindfolded and betrayed, she chose grace over fear. That is the power of a woman's voice, not just to survive, but to transform silence into legacy. In a time when women were expected to fade into history, Anne burned her name into it. Let her be remembered not as a victim of power, but as a rival to it. Not as a woman undone by ambition, but as a queen who proved ambition is not a sin, but a force that shapes empires. Her death was unjust. Her life was unforgettable, because even when her body was brought low, her voice rose higher than any sword could reach. She knelt to the sword, but stood tall in history.